On today's highlights, we learn that the people of God have good cause for rejoicing. They have received His good news of salvation. Today's key verse reads, How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace, that bringeth good tidings of good, that publisheth salvation, that saith unto Zion, Thy God reigneth. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7. This portion of the great prophet includes passages that are much beloved today, which have been described by some as poetic and literary beauty. These verses fall between the third and fourth of what are known as Isaiah's 4 servant songs. The verse immediately after our portion begins the famous fourth servant song, which many Christian commentators agree is a series of prophecies about the Christ, and frequently is titled Suffering Servant. The first song, chapter 40, verses 1 through 4, introduces the servant. In the second, chapter 49, verses 1 through 6, the servant identifies himself to the world, and in the third, chapter 50, verses 4 through 11, the servant declares his confidence in the divine. In this passage, Isaiah's message is one of divine comfort and hope, which is explicit in 51, verse 12. I, even I, am he that comforteth you. In Isaiah chapter 52, verses 3 through 6, not covered in the lesson, Israel's oppressors and those who spoke with contempt about her God met their just ends, a principle which can be extended because it speaks to our sovereign God's character of justice and righteousness. With passages such as these, God ensures that for those who trust in Him, all of their persecutors will be prosecuted, and all of their fellow prisoners will be liberated. As believers, we are also called to arise and take our rightful position as children of God. We are to no longer live in bondage and under the yoke of spiritual slavery. The Lord doesn't want to keep the salvation of His people a secret. Why? He wants other nations to worship and serve Him as well. We are often anxious about what tomorrow will bring, but when our faith burns brightly, our fear subsides and our hope is restored because we know in our hearts that our future is secure. To help us through troubled times, it is important to maintain a remembrance of God's presence in our lives, both past and present, in times of deliverance from bondage and in times of victory and restoration. We must not permit ourselves to forget our God, like Israel often forgot. We must not forget His grace, our salvation, or our great future. We must remember that our God reigns. Here's our lesson. Our society is bombarded with bad news. The newspaper and television are filled with stories of terrorist attacks, collapsing economies. We are constantly seeing the embarrassing sins of celebrities and high-profile preachers. This bad news saturation ought to make us hungry and thirsty for good news that brings hope. As believers, we have the good news that brings hope, the gospel. There is enough hope in the good news of the gospel to drown out all of the bad news that the world throws at us. This kind of hope is enough to make us go all out and praising God and rejoicing. So let's make it happen. Think of a situation you can't wait to get out of. Maybe our job, single parenthood, financial hardship, or a relationship. Now, consider today's lesson, and let's apply what we've learned. This might include warding off complacency, rejoicing with deliverance in mind, and leaving confidently, knowing that God's deliverance is sure. We've reached the end of this quarter of iLights regarding the theme Sustaining Hope. Next week, we will start the new quarter and a new theme, Acts of Worship. The study of this quarter is primarily from the New Testament, and its 3 units follow the theme of worship as it pertains to a human response to God. If you had any questions or comments about today's iLights or any other iLights, feel free to email us at fbcbsundayschool@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, thank you so much for subscribing, and may the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus.